blue whale is the loudest animal ever known to have lived. Its calls can travel for hundreds of miles through the ocean. Now imagine a sound so powerful, it made even a blue whale seem quiet. This isn't a campfire story. It isn't internet folklore. It's a real recording collected by the US government. And for years, no one could explain what made it. The summer of 1997, somewhere in the South Pacific. No earthquake, no volcanic eruption, no major storm. Then, without warning, an enormous sound echoed across the deep ocean. It wasn't picked up by just one underwater microphone. Multiple US Navy listening stations detected it. Stations separated by thousands of miles. Whatever produced that sound was powerful enough to travel across a huge section of the Pacific. Here's where things get interesting. The recording didn't sound like an explosion. It didn't match a submarine. It didn't resemble known underwater machinery. To the people analyzing it, it sounded remarkably alive. At the time, there was no public explanation. The recording stayed inside government archives, mostly forgotten, except by a small group of scientists who couldn't stop asking the same question. What made that sound? Years later, the recording was finally released to civilian researchers. The first thing they did was measure it, its frequency, its duration, its estimated source, and almost immediately, something didn't add up. A blue whale can produce an incredibly powerful call. It's the largest animal Earth has ever known, nearly 100 feet long. Yet even a blue whale's voice eventually fades into the background noise of the ocean. This sound didn't. Based on the available recordings, it appears to have traveled more than 3,000 miles. If it truly came from a single biological source, it would require something far larger than any known marine animal. Larger than any whale. Larger than anything confirmed in either the modern world or the fossil record. Researchers eventually gave the mystery a name. Simple, almost playful. They called it the Bloop. Over the years, the Bloop became one of the most studied underwater recordings ever captured. Every new analysis raised fresh questions, and very few clear answers. Once news of the recording reached the public, people immediately started speculating. Newspapers covered it, television shows debated it, and suddenly, a question that sounded like science fiction didn't seem quite so impossible. What if something enormous was still hiding in the deep ocean? Among scientists, the discussion quickly split into two very different viewpoints. Neither side had all the evidence. Neither side could completely rule the other out. Some believed the recording had a perfectly ordinary explanation. Perhaps unusual ice movement, perhaps an equipment artifact, perhaps a natural event nobody had correctly identified. Others pointed to a simple fact. We've explored only a tiny fraction of the deep ocean. There are still vast regions we've never seen, and until we've seen them, it's difficult to say with certainty what isn't there. Finding the answer meant tracing the recording back to where it came from. Not a research vessel, not a university laboratory, but one of the most secretive military surveillance systems ever built. A network created during the Cold War for a completely different purpose. To understand why this recording even exists, we have to go back to the Cold War, a time when one of the greatest military threats wasn't in the sky, but beneath the ocean. Soviet nuclear submarines could disappear beneath the surface for months at a time. Finding them before they reached American waters became a national priority. The challenge was simple. The ocean is enormous, and submarines are designed to stay silent. The solution became known as SOSUS, a vast network of underwater microphones anchored across the ocean floor. Its job wasn't to see enemy submarines, it was to hear them, even from thousands of miles away. Many of those sensors were placed inside what's known as the SOFAR channel, a unique layer of the ocean where temperature and pressure allow sound to travel extraordinary distances. A single sound entering this layer can cross entire ocean basins while losing surprisingly little energy. When the Cold War ended, much of that listening network was transferred to NOAA for scientific research. For the first time, oceanographers had access to one of the most sensitive underwater listening systems ever created. And before long, it detected something no one expected to hear. Whenever scientists come across something they can't explain, they don't jump to wild conclusions. They start by ruling out everything they already know. So that's exactly where they began. Could it have been an undersea earthquake? No. Earthquakes leave behind chaotic, jagged waveforms, messy, unpredictable signatures that look nothing like the signal they were studying. What about an underwater volcano? Again, no. Volcanic eruptions create long stretches of noisy, continuous sound with no clear pattern or structure. This recording was completely different. Maybe it was military activity, a torpedo, a depth charge, some kind of classified weapons test. That theory didn't last long. Explosives produce an instant burst of energy, a sharp spike that disappears almost immediately. The bloop didn't behave that way at all. Instead, the signal rose smoothly from low frequencies to high frequencies in one continuous sweep. No distortion, no mechanical interference, no geological fingerprints, just an almost perfectly shaped acoustic signature. Dr. Christopher Fox, who led NOAA's acoustic monitoring project at the time, noticed something even stranger. The waveform shared characteristics normally seen in biological vocalizations, especially the calls researchers had documented in large marine mammals. That single observation changed everything. Because if this really came from a living animal, then biology had a serious problem. It would mean something was alive in Earth's oceans that was larger, or at least far more powerful, than anything science had ever documented. Once news of the bloop made its way online in the late 90s and early 2000s, the story took on a life of its own. Message boards exploded with theories. Some were surprisingly grounded, others not so much. Researchers had estimated the source to be somewhere around 50 degrees south, 100 degrees west, one of the most remote, least explored stretches of ocean anywhere on Earth. A place almost no one ever visits. Then internet users noticed something bizarre. Those coordinates were uncomfortably close to the fictional resting place of Cthulhu, the ancient cosmic monster from H.P. Lovecraft's classic story, The Call of Cthulhu. Now, to be crystal clear, no one at NOAA ever treated that idea as anything more than internet folklore. But the coincidence was just strange enough to capture people's imagination. Almost overnight, the bloop stopped being a scientific mystery and became an internet legend. Ironically, the myth ended up spreading much faster than the actual science. While the internet was busy chasing monsters, NOAA researchers had discovered something far more interesting. Because the bloop wasn't the only unexplained sound hiding in their archives. As researchers dug deeper into years of hydrophone recordings, they realized the bloop wasn't a one-time event. It was just one entry in a growing catalogue of unexplained sounds. Each with its own nickname, each with its own mystery. On March 1st, 1999, the system picked up another strange signal. Researchers called it Julia, a haunting 15-second sound that almost resembled a distant human cry. Then came Train, a deep, rhythmic pulse that repeated with eerie consistency, almost like something enormous moving through the water in a fixed pattern. And then there was perhaps the strangest one of all. Slow Down, a deep, descending groan that lasted nearly 7 full minutes, long enough to be detected by listening stations spread across the entire southern hemisphere. None of these sounds matched known machinery. None matched any confirmed marine animal. But when scientists mapped where they all came from, every trail led to the same place, Antarctica. At that point, researchers realized there was only one way to solve the mystery. They couldn't do it from behind a computer screen. If they wanted real answers, they had to go to the source, the coldest, most isolated, and most unforgiving place on Earth. To find the source once and for all, NOAA launched a series of research expeditions. Icebreakers headed south. New generations of underwater listening equipment were deployed along the edge of Antarctica. If the sound was happening there, this was their best chance to catch it. For years, scientists collected recordings in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. The goal wasn't to prove a theory, it was simply to follow the evidence, wherever it led. Eventually, the data pointed to an answer. And it wasn't what many people expected. Instead of supporting the idea of an unknown creature, the evidence steadily pulled researchers in a completely different direction. The Bloop turned out not to be a one-time event. Researchers found thousands of remarkably similar sounds recorded throughout the Southern Ocean, again and again and again, each one sharing almost the same acoustic fingerprint. Think about what that would mean if these sounds really came from animals. It wouldn't require one undiscovered giant. It would require thousands of them, producing nearly identical calls, year after year, without a single confirmed sighting. At that point, the biological explanation became harder and harder to defend. No known marine animal behaves that way. Nothing produces signals that consistent, that repeatable, and that widespread over such long periods of time. Little by little, the idea of an unknown sea creature began falling apart. But while one mystery faded, another pattern emerged. The sounds weren't randomly distributed throughout the year. They peaked during very specific months. Those months matched almost perfectly with the Antarctic summer, the time of year when rising temperatures place the greatest stress on Antarctica's ice shelves. That coincidence was difficult to ignore. Researchers recalculated the source locations using years of additional data. The results were striking. The sounds weren't coming from the open Pacific after all. They consistently traced back to the edge of Antarctica, specifically to the places where enormous floating ice shelves meet the open ocean. A boundary where billions of tons of ancient ice are constantly shifting, cracking, and breaking apart. To better understand what they were seeing, scientists turned to a relatively new field known as cryoseismology. Instead of studying earthquakes caused by moving tectonic plates, cryoseismologists study vibrations created by massive glaciers and ice sheets as they fracture and move. The deeper they looked, the clearer the picture became. The source of one of the most famous unexplained sounds ever recorded beneath the ocean wasn't flesh and blood. It was ice, under extraordinary pressure, moving on a truly enormous scale. In 2012, after 15 years of research, NOAA released its official conclusion. The Bloop was not an unknown creature. According to NOAA scientist Robert Giac, the recording was entirely consistent with what's known as an icequake, a powerful fracture created when enormous sections of Antarctic ice crack, shift, or break away from a glacier. Researchers compared the bloop to recordings collected during the breakup of a massive Antarctic iceberg known as A53A. The similarities were remarkable. The waveforms, the frequency, the overall acoustic pattern, they matched far more closely than anyone expected. When an iceberg fractures, or grinds against surrounding ice, or even scrapes across the sea floor, it releases enormous amounts of energy. That energy becomes low-frequency sound, and once it enters the SOFAR channel, it can travel for thousands of miles through the ocean. Exactly the kind of signal the Navy's underwater microphones were built to detect. As the crack spreads through the ice, the pitch naturally changes. To human ears, that rise and fall can sound surprisingly similar to the call of a living animal. Not because the ice is imitating biology, but because physics sometimes produces patterns that feel unexpectedly familiar. The same explanation also helped solve several other famous underwater mysteries. Signals nicknamed Julia, slow down, and train all showed characteristics consistent with moving or fracturing Antarctic ice. Different recordings, different locations, but the same underlying process. According to NOAA, these events happen far more often than most people realize. Thousands of icequakes occur across Antarctica every year. And thanks to the SOFAR channel, many of them can be detected from astonishing distances. After 15 years, one of the ocean's most famous mysteries finally had an answer. Officially, the case was closed. For people hoping the bloop would lead to some giant undiscovered creature, the conclusion felt disappointing. The monster was gone, replaced by careful measurements, years of field research, and a remarkably ordinary explanation. But for the scientists who solved the mystery, the story didn't end there. Because once they understood what they were actually hearing, they realized something even more important. The real message hidden inside the bloop was never about a monster beneath the ocean. It was about the changing planet above it. So, the mystery was solved. But in many ways, the real answer turned out to be even more significant than the mystery itself. According to NOAA researchers, the kinds of icequakes that produced the bloop are part of a much larger story. As Antarctica's ice shelves shift, fracture, and break apart, they release enormous amounts of energy into the ocean. The sound wasn't a creature calling through the deep. It was the sound of ice under immense stress. Looking back, the bloop wasn't evidence of an undiscovered animal. It was an unexpected record of something already happening on our planet. A moment when the ocean captured the sound of Antarctica changing, years before most people were paying attention. That doesn't mean we've explored everything, not even close. We've mapped only a small fraction of the deep ocean. There are still places no human has ever seen, and there are almost certainly discoveries waiting to be made. But this particular mystery wasn't pointing toward an unseen monster beneath the sea. It was pointing toward something far closer, something happening in the world above the water. Right now, sometimes, nature doesn't whisper. Sometimes, it echoes across an entire ocean. The ocean wasn't hiding a monster. It was carrying a message. If you enjoyed this deep dive, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. I read as many of them as I can. And if you're fascinated by the science behind the ocean's biggest mysteries, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There are plenty more stories like this, And trust me, we're only getting started.